Hello, my name is Alan Foom, and today I'm going to talk about energy subsidies, particularly for fossil fuels. It's become quite a big issue relatively recently. Now, the International Monetary Fund wrote quite a detailed report, and a big headline was fossil fuel subsidies surged to a record 7 trillion. And here's a map from our world in data showing which countries do most of the subsidizing. Now, I'll talk a little bit about that later. But first of all, we'll talk about subsidies and what's really happening and what's going on. Now, Berman, an energy consultant, did quite a detailed analysis of this, so these are some slides from his blog. And he had IMF's 7.1 trillion is misleading. Now, 5.7 trillion of that is for environmental costs and foregone consumption taxes. So that's the damage that fossil fuels do. Their estimate by the IMF. And the real subsidy is about 1.3 trillion, which is still quite a lot of money. That's coming up to the GDP of the UK. That's significant. And 93% of the subsidies went to consumers and not to help with high energy costs and not to fossil fuel companies. So consumers get most of the subsidy, and quite a lot of that is damage that's done. Now, subsidies and externalities. So explicit subsidies form direct support for business activity for governments. So a subsidy paid for a consumer is less than would have been without government intervention, whatever that intervention might be. And we'll talk a little bit about that in a minute. And externality is a cost to a third party resulting from activity which is not covered by payment from that activity. So, for example, fossil fuels do damage. There's lung respiratory damage due to NOx, SOx, particulates, etc. From pollution coming out of factories and cars, etc. The increased CO2 emissions, traffic congestion, accidents such as oil spills, land habitat damage to economic activity, etc., etc., etc. Quite a bit of damage. Also, quite a lot of good that's done because of fossil fuels and economic activity that we do. But these damages are not that easy to calculate because they're counterfactuals. Would the hurricane have happened that we would have been pumping CO2? Well, I don't know that. So Nate Huggins did this plot where the dark red is the explicit subsidies, real subsidies, and the pink is implicit subsidies or the damage. So it's quite a big growth between 21 and 22 where the cost of energy increased. There's quite a lot of support to people as a result of that to keep the economy going. I can argue whether that's good or bad, etc. Probably quite good actually too, because I like keeping warm too. So the types of subsidies. So the subsidies to producers and subsidies to consumers. So subsidies to producers are to encourage an activity which may otherwise be less profitable. Now, there could be all sorts of things such as soft loans, insurance guarantees, price support, quite a big thing in some electricity generation. So contract for difference, price guarantees, feed-in tariffs, etc. Preferential tax treatment with respect to other economic activity, adverse treatment of contributing goods and technology, enabling economic activity. So things like new road or rail projects that will support something. Subsidies to consumers, so aim to encourage consumption or enable consumption which would otherwise be difficult to afford for that particular consumer. So goods are sold below the true cost. So things like direct grants such as energy support payments, price cap social tariffs, red diesel for farmers, tax rebates, soft loans for capital equipment, reduce prices for technologies such as if you have a heat pump versus a boiler, heat pumps subsidized at 50% or something like that. And regulatory incentives to favor technologies to make you want to adopt things like that. So give you an example why people subsidize some activities. So each society has its own priorities. These priorities are influenced by politicians, influenced by NGOs, industries, media, civil society, and all these other lobbyists. So each society has got its own priorities, whatever those priorities are. And subsidies and incentives can be used to achieve a social goal. So, for example, allowing poor people to have an acceptable standard of living, keeping favored industries going, achieving environmental goals, ensuring security. Now, once subsidies are actually in place, they're very difficult to remove because the lobbyists keep lobbying to keep them there. And subsidies do distort the free market. Now, if you're a free market fundamentalist, you might be a little bit upset about that. If you're a little bit more socially conscious, you may think differently. So an example is EV cars in Norway. There's a slide from a video I made earlier on a subject. Basically what happens is electric cars are cheaper in Norway than gasoline-powered cars because gasoline-powered cars have all of these disincentive taxes. Now, Norway wants to reduce usage of gasoline-powered cars, which is why they have the highest consumption of electric cars in the world, and they're a fairly rich country, so they can afford it. Maybe different countries may think different, but that's Norway's priority. Free country, democratic country, that's what they choose to do. So Art Berman's had a look at subsidies for consumers versus producers. So consumers are in the light blue color and producers are in orange. So you can see the vast majority of subsidies go to producers. And also, however, quite a lot of the implicit subsidies, so these are the externalities, the damage, is in sky blue, consumer subsidies in yellow, producer subsidies in orange. So you can see coal, for example, has quite a lot of externalities, but gets very little in the way of subsidy, and this is electricity. If you look at subsidies by year, and are extracted back to 2010, so again, oil, natural gas, electricity, and coal. So these are consumption subsidies, and you can see they've increased significantly in 2022 as the price of energy has increased. Again, you can see people are being kept warm, which otherwise you will have significant social effects. And which countries do it? Again, biggest subsidies on OPEC Plus, so it's OPEC, Egypt, Indonesia, Uzbekistan, OPEC Plus, the main oil producers cartel, plus Russia and Mexico and a few other people. Asia, Europe, Latin America, Africa, and very little North America. Artists from Texas. Who owns the resources? Now, you could argue that most of the oil that's and gas resources that are there are owned by national oil companies. And I've got a video on national oil companies on my channel which explains what they are. Only 14% of global oil, coal and gas is actually owned by IOCs, international oil companies, international energy companies. So most of the subsidies are paid by governments to their own NOCs, if subsidies there are. Most NOCs are actually big cash cows. But renewable energy actually gets, frankly, a lot more subsidy. Now, that could be fair enough if that's the priority of a country that's there, but let's be honest about it. That's your priority, that's what you want to do. Be honest and say this is we're subsidizing for a greater good. That's fine. So who gives the subsidies? You can see from here, they're actually mostly Middle Eastern countries like Iran, Libya, Saudi Arabia, some former Soviet Union countries that are slightly poorer, such as Uzbekistan, Ukraine, that don't have very much in the way of resources. Turkmenistan has quite a lot of gas, actually. Plus other countries like Algeria, Egypt, etc. Now, again, this is to ensure that their domestic consumers get relatively cheaper energy. And let's be honest, none of these countries, with the exception of Trinidad and Tobago, are all that democratic. So trying to keep the populace happy is a big thing for these people. If you're looking at motor gasoline, so this is something I put together a wee while ago. So again, the blue is the price of gasoline that people pay, and the orange is the relative consumption. So you've got USA, Russia, and Indonesia to have relatively low taxes, but basically are neutral. So that's what, again, that's what a litre of gasoline would have cost without any tax incentives. And some of these other countries like Venezuela, Sudan, Algeria, Kuwait, they get very cheap gasoline to their consumers. Now, again, that's what they decide to do. That's their business. But subsidies do encourage waste and smuggling. For example, Nigeria and Benin border, quite a lot of tankers take gasoline across the border. But their major benefit to the population and the reduction of subsidies tends to lead to rioting, which is not such a good thing. Another example of subsidies is back close to home in the UK. Winter 2022, again, this is a video I did last year, looking at the scale of subsidies to domestic consumers. And this is the level of government support that's there. So that's what would have happened without support, without a price cap. Now the consumers would pay the red line, solid red line, and all of that was basically picked up by HM government. Again, was it a good thing? Well, yeah, it kind of prevented a humanitarian catastrophe with a lot of people freezing to death. Fortunately, we had a mild winter, so it wasn't so bad. But that's an example of a subsidy. And most of it is fossil fuel because the UK is still fossil fuel dependent, particularly for heating and gas, where 85% of the homes in the UK have gas central heating. But come to taxes. Now, most countries actually tax gas relatively heavily. Now, I mentioned Indonesia and Russia that have relatively low taxes. That's what the price of gasoline would be. These are what the retail price of gasoline would have been without any tax incentives, and the orange is the level of taxes. So if you're driving, for example, in Denmark or Greece or the UK, where I am, you pay a heck of a lot of tax on a litre of gasoline that you put in your car. Again, you could say that's fair enough because the tax goes to fund various government programs and also pay for some of the environmental damage. But let's be honest about it. This is what they're doing. This is what our society says. And Richard Norris of Pandreco put this together, which is a graph showing UK taxes in terms of gasoline. So the black bit here is the actual cost of the gasoline. Then this is the petrol duty, and this is the tax on the tax, the VAT. So you pay VAT on all of this lot, so you actually pay tax on tax. And the aim is to reduce gas guzzling, and raise revenue. But the largest impact is obviously on lower middle class consumers. Rich people can sort of swallow it up. Really poor people don't have cars, but the lower middle class, they get squeezed. Again, that's what society chooses. That's what society chooses. And this is Richard's more detailed analysis of retail gasoline taxes in each country. So it's a little bit similar to what I did, only far more detail. And again, please have a look at his blog on Pandreco, and he discusses this in some detail. Producers also pay a lot of tax. So this is Acadian Energy, and this is oil price in orange. This is UKCS tax, and this is green line is the relative tax share. So went up to nearly 90% for old fields under the old regimes back before the 1990s with a special tax called petroleum revenue tax, or PRT. Then PRT was abolished for new fields by Lamont in 1993. But it obviously kept going for the old fields. Old fields tended to have been a bit bigger because all these were discovered and developed in the 1970s, 1980s. They still carried on paying until Osborne abolished it back in 2015. And you can see that taxes go up and down. We've had a big windfall tax recently on oil producers. Again, did quite a lot of damage to the oil and gas industry, but again, there it is. And this is how oil and gas is taxed relative to other industries. Quite a substantial difference even now. And the UK is one of the relatively low taxpayers. If you look at some other countries like Trinidad and Tobago, Nigeria, etc., you pay 85-90% tax. That's a lot of tax. So these countries tend to be a lot more dependent on oil revenue than some others, but it's still noticeable in the UK relative to others. So summary. Fossil IMF reports generated a lot of comments, but most of these subsidies, actually externalities, damage caused by using fossil fuels. Now, it's fair enough you quantify the damage, and maybe you need to see what you can do to pay for that, but there's also quite a lot of benefit from that. So explicit real subsidies, actually a small portion of the total, about a seventh. Still quite a large sum of money, nearly the UK's GDP. But most of these subsidies are for consumer support, so they're price caps, sales tax reduction, social tariffs, enabling poor people to have energy. Most consumer subsidies are concentrated in oil-producing countries, so the likes of the Saudi Arabias, the Algerias, and Nigerias. OECD consumers generally pay a lot of energy consumption taxes. But each society chooses what it wishes to do. There are some producer subsidies, including investment tax credits, etc., but producers also pay a lot of tax, a heck of a lot of tax. And the main point here is each society must decide how it wishes to tax and spend on national priorities, national values, what society wants to do. And all societies are different, and we must understand that, we must respect that. So thank you very much. Please like, please subscribe, and I'll see you on the next one.